Hello there. Very good afternoon, good evening. Welcome to the panel discussion on neutralizing the cyber threat spike, brought to you by the Economic Times and by Sophos. Thank you all very much for joining us. Thanks to all the audience members and the panelists. My name is Alokesh Bhattacharyya. I'm senior editor of the Economic Times. I will host today's discussion along with my colleague Suchetana.
Hi, I'm Suchetana Ray, Senior Assistant Editor of the Economic Times. Good afternoon to all of you, and it's an absolute pleasure to have you today on the panel. Before we begin, a quick round of introductions. We have with us Durga Prasad Swaminathan, CIO, Cholamandalam Investment and Finance Company, Ankush Tiwari, VP and Head, Digital Services, Quest Global, Priyank Kothari, Head, Information Security, Tesco Business Services.
We also have with us Murad, the CIO of CRISIL, Prateek Bhajanka, Senior Principal Analyst of Gartner, John Shier, Senior Security Advisor with Sophos, and Sunil Sharma, Managing Director Sales for India and SAARC at Sophos.
Before we dive into the panel discussion today, Alokesh and I will take just a few minutes to set the context. So, as we've noticed that cyber criminals have never been as active, perhaps, as during this phase of the pandemic. In fact, many say that the COVID-19 pandemic was perhaps accompanied by another pandemic, which is cyber security threats. Various reports point to staggering numbers. The FBI says its cyber division received 400% more complaints of cyber attacks than before the pandemic. Another report says COVID themed phishing and social engineering attacks climbed to 20,000 to 30,000 per day in the US alone. Everywhere you look, the world over, you see that cyber attacks have clocked high three-digit percentage growth rates, as they say that the criminal is always a step ahead of the regulators.
Right, and they stay a step ahead and they keep attacking all of us. The attacks are targeted at corporations, governments, critical infrastructure, not to mention individuals like you and me, right? We are also their obvious targets. Now, what has happened because of the pandemic is that the cyber criminals have exploited our fear and our uncertainty, right? And the wholesale shift by governments, enterprises, and society to digital communication and collaboration tools. This is a big shift that has happened. If you look at the India numbers, there's one survey report that says that 7 out of 10 Indian companies saw increase in cyber attacks since the lockdown. And another report says that over 66% Indian companies have faced at least one data breach since March. That's a lot of companies.
Yeah, such a situation would normally lead to a spurt in investments in cybersecurity, but reports indicate otherwise. Reports say that businesses were busy with ensuring business continuity, and cybersecurity investments actually perhaps took a backseat. In fact, we at Economic Times recently executed a CXO survey, which points to the same inference. And that is perhaps the worry, because cybersecurity needs to be at the top of the priority list for companies, and perhaps it needs to be also deliberated at length, even in board discussions.
Right. And so, there are lots and lots of points to ponder. Has the cybersecurity paradigm really changed forever? Are we as much at risk now as at the beginning of the pandemic? Right. And what are the new threats, or, well, threats you can say will remain similar, but what are the more prominent threat areas today? Now, for example, the cloud has emerged, more or less emerged as a savior towards ensuring business continuity for all of us and continuity in life processes also. But how safe and how secure really is the cloud?
So to take these questions and to take these questions forward and debate on larger issues, we have on the panel today cybersecurity leaders from some of India's top organizations, and we hope today's discussion will throw some light on the steps that companies should take to neutralize this spike in cyber threats. And to start things off, I would like to invite John from Sophos to give his opening address. John.
Thank you very much, and good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the session. As you all know, as security defenders, and as my co-panelists know, security is about managing risk. What we try to do is we try to reduce the risk as much as possible so that we can have a better handle on what's happening in our organizations and our environments, and then we can fight off the cyber criminals wherever we can find them. But this year introduced a lot more risk than I think many of us planned on and really didn't expect. We had to move from home about a year ago. Now we had to move from home, and many did so without proper plans, proper equipment, proper monitoring that allowed them to keep that same level of risk mitigation that they probably had when they were working within their own organizations. And so things were upended. This presented an opportunity for scammers and cyber criminals alike to ramp up their attacks on everybody, as has been pointed out by Suchetana and Alokesh. But what we've seen is there have been two waves of criminality, if you will. We had the one side sort of starting in early April of last year, where a lot of the scammers got involved, and we started seeing a lot of the COVID-19 themed scams that were happening. And then we also had the cyber criminals in around March or so started to pick up on this aspect, this new pandemic, to start sending out emails that were including things like malicious attachments. So the TrickBot banking Trojan group was known to have started this in March. They started with Italy, which was one of the hardest hit regions at the time in Western Europe, and then moved across the globe as the pandemic swept across the globe. And then as we look at closer to home for you in India, we did a survey last year on ransomware, and we found that globally 51% of organizations were hit with ransomware, and 73% of those had their data encrypted. With India, that toll was even higher. It was 82% of organizations that we surveyed in India were hit with ransomware last year, and 92% of them were encrypted. And what's important when you're thinking about something like ransomware, ransomware is the noisiest thing you're going to see. It's not the first thing you're going to see. And one of the things that stuck out to me in another survey on the threat detection was that the average detection time globally is about 5 days or 117 hours. Now that means that an attacker will be in your network for an average of 5 days before you actually detect something and act on it. Now, unfortunately, in India, those detection times grow to 228 hours or 9.5 days. So there's a bit of a lag there. And I think that points to some basic security that might be lacking. But we've also seen other things that are exacerbating the problem. Ransomware has gotten a lot nastier. The payments are higher than ever. They're over $1 million now, with some of the highest ones being in the 30s, $34 million, I believe is the largest one I've seen to date. And they're adding extortion or additional extortion, as if ransomware wasn't enough, by exfiltrating your data, holding that to ransom unless you pay as well. And we've seen even nastier tricks. They're contacting your employees and trying to recruit them to pressure the businesses into actually into paying the ransom. So with this stratification of ransomware offerings, where we've got very highly skilled criminals that are very stealthy and very capable, down to the more script kiddie-like point and click ransomware as a service offerings, we're seeing a lot of people getting involved and making a lot of money. At the end, this is an opportunity for us to start looking at digital transformation. And many of you are probably pushed into it because of the pandemic, because of working from home. And this doesn't just mean just adding firewalls and more VPN capacity. These are opportunities for upgrading your security program, including the products. And this is really a chance at looking at things like zero trust as the next way for you to stay safer as an organization. So thank you for letting us have this discussion today, and I'll pass it on to Prateek from Gartner.
Thank you very much, John, for that, for setting the context. As you mentioned, you've given us some scary figures. 51% companies globally are hit with ransomware, and the situation in India, as you've pointed out, is graver. And as you mentioned, that herein lies an opportunity for us to upgrade to the zero trust mindset, really. With this, I would now like to invite Prateek from Gartner to give a context for today's discussion. Prateek.
Thank you, Suchetana, and thank you everyone for having me here. Hi, I'm Prateek, and thank you, John, for setting the context very well, very at the very beginning of the conversation and the discussion here. And in fact, to your point where you were talking about the scary figures of the ransomware and other such attacks during the pandemic situation in India, this is one thing that I have observed over a period of years here, that in India, in India, it was already a candy store for a lot of the cyber hackers and the attackers across the globe. And with the pandemic situation, the candies in the store also got even more, for the reason that the traditional reliance of Indian organizations on the network security. Now that everybody started working from home, the cover of network security was blown away, and there was no security control which could guard them. And because of that particular reason, a lot of new vulnerabilities and a lot of more candies and more data that started getting exposed to the attackers, that they started making or taking advantage of. And to have a small slide deck, definitely I will not bore you by or give you a death by presentation, but this is one of the slide that I would like to bring up and to give a lay of the land. So let me just quickly turn it up here. And if you ask me, I particularly like the topic of the discussion today, neutralizing the cyber threat spike. As security professional, as we are continuously evolving in line with the threat landscape and trying to outrun them, today I feel all of us are gathered here to discuss the next stage of evolution that we can bring in the industry, which can take us forward in the security in the right direction. And on that particular point, if you look at it, I like to look at I like to look at pandemic as another opportunity. Every disaster has a value. Pandemic was one such disaster, and because of this disaster, organizations and even the senior leadership and the board of directors, they have started putting cybersecurity back on the front burner. Which could have been overlooked for a period of time, but it is not now no longer the case, and they have started putting that on the front burner. And that is the reason we have already started seeing early signs of renewed interest. And according to the latest survey that we had run, the Gartner 2020 Board of Directors survey, cybersecurity related risk was pegged as the second highest source of risk for the enterprise, followed by regulatory and compliance risk, which tells us that the board of directors and the senior leadership and the business leadership, they are very much aware of the problem that we are facing, and they are very much they are very much committed to solve that particular problem. But I feel there is still a major gap that we are not able to fulfill as security professionals, where we are not able to fill the gap between their expectations and what we are able to cater to. And primarily because of the reason that we may not be effectively communicating with the business leader. One of the challenges that I see across the client inquiries and the conversations that I have with the clients in Gartner, a lot of the organizations still talk very in a very technical manner, in a very technological term, in front of the board of directors, and that is something may not resonate with the board of directors. We should understand that the board of directors is someone who would understand three basic parameters: cost, revenue, and risk. So we should be able to translate all these security related investment outcome and operations and the kind of initiatives that we are taking in these three terms. And on that particular topic, I would like to just talk about the board of directors and the effective communication by quoting the profound words of Nelson Mandela, that if you talk to a person in a language that he or she understands, that goes to his or her head. If you talk to him or her in his own language, that goes to his or her heart. So if we want to make a mark in the board of directors, if you want to convince them, if you want to get their commitment, if you want to get them on our side and help them understand what is required, we will have to talk in their language, which is in the business language, and translate the risk and translate the technical risk into the business risk. So let's start with the lay of the land as well. When we are talking about the landscape, when we are talking about the kind of situation that we have in hand, let's see what are a few things that we have been observing all this while in the security industry, and that too particularly among Indian organizations. Over my experience of 10 years, I've been seeing that Indian organizations take a very skewed and traditional approach of compliance focused approach. As John also mentioned, that organizations are looking at compliance focused approach, and compliance and regulations may not be able to keep up to the pace, or keep up the pace with the evolving threat landscape. And I see that most of the Indian organizations are still taking that approach, where taking the tick in the box approach. A very common example would be the very basic security service or security capability called vulnerability assessment. Most of the organizations that we see, they may be performing vulnerability assessment once in 3 months or once in 4 months to tick off that box in the compliance, where ISO 27001 may say that perform vulnerability assessment annually or in a regularly manner. But if you look at it, the number of vulnerabilities that are getting discovered, they are getting discovered on daily basis. So if you are scanning your system once in 3 months, once in 4 months, you're not effectively identifying the vulnerabilities, and you are leaving a huge gap and an exposure window on which you are susceptible to attacks. So this is my point about the fact that let's not look at the compliance, but let's look at the real risk reduction. Let's not only look at reducing the risk on paper by doing the vulnerability assessment and doing the tick in the box, but try to reduce the risk in real. The other point that I was talking about, the fact that we are over relying on traditional network security and network security delivery through the local delivery of the security capabilities. But with the with the associates, with the employees moving to remote workers, they, or in remote location, they do not get the same capabilities of security delivered through the internet. And that is where we need local independent or location independent services delivered to the, or security services delivered to the employees and the associates. So it should be location independent, it should be pervasive security. No matter where you are located, you should be able to get the same level of security. And also the knee-jerk reaction to the pandemic. Over the pandemic period, we have seen so many cases where organizations, to get to the business continuity, they had to open the 3389 port and so many ports, other ports on the data center or in the server, so that the remote workers can get access to the system. So all these situations only aggravate the problem, and that is definitely one of the situations that we are trying to deal with. Without taking more than a minute here, the key recommendations that I would strongly suggest that every organization should have a look at to start the discussion with would be that you should be focused on doing the simple things well in information security, rather than just running after the shiny things and the new technologies that are coming up in the market. You should be empowering your workforce into, and trying to turn them into security citizens, and imbibe the culture of you see something, you say something. A lot of data breach investigation have shown us that there were some indicators, or the employees and the associates could see a lot of indicators of the data breach, but because of the lack of formal process or governance process, the indicators of compromise or those indicators were never reported. The other part that I would talk about, that we are talking about ransomware, as John also mentioned, that the magnitude of ransomware is quite grave at this point of time. But in spite of the fact that ransomware is such a common menace, I see that Indian organizations do not have an incident response policy specifically catering to ransomware and supply chain attacks. So having a ransomware incident response program and supply chain attack response program would certainly be very useful here. On that particular point, I would close my note, and I'll look forward to the next part of the discussion, where we will talk about the various different scenarios that we faced, and how can we specifically solve those challenges. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Prateek. That was quite enlightening. In fact, I'm quite happy to see that your board survey, points to cybersecurity risk as the second most recognized threat to corporations by board members, which is quite a big thing. And of course, compliance is number one, which is always going to be. And it is the same thing, even in boards, there's a question of, are you only checking the boxes, or are you actually doing compliance? Are you changing your system? So, and I'm not only talking about digital, there are many other compliances boards have to do, right? So great. So, some very nice thoughts to start off this session with. Let me share one very interesting thing. When you talk about data, there was this cartoon that I saw, a few months ago. There's this, must be Dilbert, or one of those very famous cartoons, right? So this guy, wakes up sweating profusely in the middle of the night, and he's thinking, like, when you realize, and the background thing is, when you realize that your data is being shipped to a Chinese, to the Chinese government, you wake up and you're sweating profusely. And the next image shows sleeping in aram se so raha hai. So you're asking, then the background says, when you realize that your data is as worthless as you are. So, right? But the point, of course, is that enterprise data is not worthless, and so we have to take them much more seriously than this cartoon in particular did. And just a quick note to the audience, we have about 350 people who have joined us already. Thank you all for finding time for joining us. Just remember that if you have a question, I can already see some questions there. You need to put them in the Q&A tab that you can see in your control panel, right? Don't put in the chat, because chat has been disabled. And of course, depending on time, we will take your questions to the panel, and we might even get you on camera, one or two of you on camera, to ask your question directly to the panel. Again, depending on time, it's not a commitment. So now that we are going to move into the panel discussion, the first question that we are going to ask the panel, I want to ask that question to the audience first. So let us have the first poll. And the poll is, did your organization see increased threat perception due to the new paradigm of remote work?
Quite a lot is a clear winner here.
Yeah, but a very close second is yes, but not as much as is being talked about. Okay, we have almost 200 votes in. There's a sizable chunk that says maybe, but as an employee, I didn't feel it. That points to the success of the CISOs in handling the situation. If I didn't feel it, that means you handled it well, right? That's
and 28% say that. See, maybe and not really. That's 28%.
Yeah. Well, okay. Good insight. Good stuff. You can stop the poll and you can see the results. So the top one is yes, quite a lot, but not as much as is being talked about. Is also not very close, but close. Fine. Thank you. We can remove the poll from it. So let's now get into this panel, and Suchetana, over to you.
Thank you. So we saw what the audience had to say and what the poll had to say. So now tell us from a cybersecurity leader's perspective, and I'll begin with Mr. Swaminathan here. Did your organization and industry see increased threat perception? Which would be your answer to that poll is my question. Along with that, give me one example of a cybersecurity measure that you took in the last few months, which has helped address a new threat perception. Mr. Swaminathan.
Thank you and good afternoon to all. And I agree with the first option, which was I think the majority voted that there was an increase. And I would say it's, the attackers out there are getting more and more context aware. And I think they took advantage of the scenario that we had of, the pandemic in one place and the whole opportunity that everybody's working remote. So the typical defense in depth kind of situation was taken out of the whole equation there. So that was a very good opportunity that we saw increase in attacks at that, the initial phases of the pandemic. And then over time, it started flattening out. So that's where I would agree that there was an increase there, and it's getting more opportunistic. So while you had like a COVID test kind of bait coming in earlier in the cycle, now it is going on to the vaccine period because that's where the whole world is moving towards. So each of those are getting very context specific, and that's the nature of how this whole space operates. And in answer to your second question, we started with the basics. Some of the stuff that we did was, since people are working remotely, are we making sure their AV is up to date, their patching is up to date? So we started with those basics for the first step. Then we, given a lot of us still connect significantly with third parties, so making sure that is a more, increased rigor around reviewing the firewall connectivities that we have across. So that was one part of, making sure we cover the basics besides, the continuous messaging going on to the users to be more aware and sharing part. And I think very niche areas we started exploring was some kind of, behavioral authentication, to making sure that if somebody's credentials are, trapped through a keylog or whatever, are there ways for us to make sure we can go back and authenticate? So we try to bring some of those capabilities in. So that's kind of what we've been trying to do beyond the typical security that we're going across.
Fantastic. Thank you, Mr. Swaminathan, for that. Can I come to Priyank Kothari next? Priyank from Tesco, the same question. Did you see a rise in the threats and what do you do about it?
Thank you, Alokesh. I think very relevant, and giving the poll by the audience and the responses, I think it is also important to set a little bit more context around it. I think a simple answer is yes. And I think the reason for that is we are talking about an environment where the attack surface is much more larger. Colleagues or employees are no more sitting behind the corporate firewall. We are talking about a space where personal and professional space is converging. So more use of personal devices, so no more, well-protected corporate devices. We are talking about a whole set of new systems coming into play because suddenly new set of cloud collaboration tools which were not so well tested and where colleagues are not so familiar with, these sort of new tools. So there is a bit of, ambiguity around it as well from an awareness standpoint. And I think lastly, we are talking about a setup where the controls are not similar to your corporate environment. There are fewer layers of security. So I think these all are indicators of increased risk profile. And I think on the back of this, clearly the threat perception around data security and data privacy in particular has significantly gone up. I think coming to the second part of the question, I think rather than picking one single control, I think more from a security strategy standpoint, I think there are 3 to 4 key areas where the focus and emphasis has been more, particularly during this COVID period. I think one particularly is very obvious, your cloud infrastructure and environment. Suddenly the focus is a lot more on what cloud applications you have, which are exposed, the servers and services, how you're protecting those, the entire sort of your cloud landscape. I think the second is, given colleagues or employees are connecting from home or remotely, their authentication is the underlying pillar, right? That's the only differentiation between a legitimate sort of colleague entering vis-a-vis, an attacker. So I think two-factor authentication sort of controls are extremely key and sort of underlying to support this sort of work environment. Third is obviously your set of web-based controls, just not just your own corporate environment, but how you can extend that to the personal landscape or personal devices. And I think we all have spoken about phishing, how phishing has significantly increased. In fact, I was reading one of the report where Google has called out that there are 18 million just COVID-related phishing mails every day that they have noticed. So that's the scale of phishing exposure that we are talking about. And so there are a lot of more focus in terms of not only from a technology perspective, but also from a colleague awareness standpoint, because I think we need to realize just one more aspect, that we are talking about an environment which will continue to be distributed, which means you will have colleagues working from home. And at least in the near future, you may not be able to match both the security environments in terms of the level of security you have within your corporate setup versus how colleagues are connecting from home. Thus, you need to continue to invest in colleague awareness. Earlier, you may be doing 6 monthly or yearly those phishing simulations. It has to be more monthly, more frequent, more focused, is what I would say.
Right, Priyank. I'll go to Mr. Murad from here. So same question. Of course, as we realize with the data that we've been quoting, that threat perception has increased. So what is the one step that your company has taken in controlling that and in response to the increased threat perception?
Yeah, I think, the idea of zero trust is extremely important. The awareness that, you need to start to move towards zero trust allows you to start to think about where the different angles of attack that can come in, right? I think employee awareness is very, very significant, and having campaigns internal to the corporate so that, you're sending dummy phish me emails, and having those campaigns allows you to start to understand how aware your employees are, because if they're clicking on a link coming in from a place that is going to send you, I don't know, $1 million worth, if you give them another $1,000 or something like that, right? And if people continue to click on that, then you know that you have not done a good job, right? So phish me emails, I think, are important. And also now, as people are have switched over to remote work, and you are still giving them corporate laptops, making sure from a leakage prevention that USB devices and everything else that connects to those laptops is very well closed off and secured is important. And then, as you start to have partnerships with other partners that may be SaaS providers or other businesses that you exchange, they're in the same pool as you are, right? So attackers may be going after them. So having a good vendor assessment program to understand where they are from their cyber prevention perspective, because a lot of times we think about data is internal to our organization, that we have control, and of course we can invest and we can close down all of those areas, but then we're also sharing data with other organizations, right, that we work with, be it, we may have assets on the cloud. Is the cloud provider that we're using, are they following all of the best practices? Are they investing at the right levels? And making sure that you have a good security assessment program. And one of the things that as everybody moved, most companies actually did invest a lot in security. As I hear and I have conversations, most companies have invested in VPN. I think that was one of the first things, because people are working A lot of people have moved to VDI, and understanding of how to lock down VDI is something that came in, so it's a container that's running inside essentially a hostile environment because it's a personal device. Then you treat it like a hostile device, but how do you containerize it? How do you secure it? And then, of course, there's some leakage preventions that you can put in. So any cybersecurity program, there's no single answer to it. You have to look at every single vector, every single angle, and then start to invest. And you still have external threats, but you also have insider threats as well. So you have to keep an eye on all of those aspects. And I think we talk a lot about external threats, but insider threat is also something that continues on.
Insider threat is, in fact, it's the insider threat that actually sometimes is not even a threat, right? It's just an unaware employee who doesn't know what to click, and you click on the wrong thing and you introduce a massive security breach for the organization, right? So Ankush, your view on this whole aspect, and also do enlighten us on some steps that you've taken.
Yeah, thanks, Alokesh, and good afternoon, everyone. So for us, I just like to define what's the macro trend that changed, let's say, last 12 to 14 months for all of us. We were all moving towards like loving our centralized IT system. Everything was getting centralized, controlled centrally, fantastic. Everybody was enjoying that experience. Suddenly, boom, one day, we call it work from home. I mean, I call it work from anywhere. Actually, that's what is happening. And if we look at its deglobalization or decentralization of workforce that has happened. Now, when I look at decentralization of workforce that has happened, so maybe it's easy to say, hey, you instead of coming to office, you sit at home. That's probably decentralization in terms of workforce. But when we look at the IT infra, it's a nightmare. I mean, I can't decentralize my IT infra, which I have built over years, secure a lot of things, secure a lot of endpoints, and do it overnight. Second point was the lot of endpoints that changed, right? With this decentralization, the new endpoints that came in, which could bring threats. And as Alokesh, you were correctly pointing out, a lot of times unknowingly employees do not know a lot of things that were naturally available to them in their enterprise environment when they were sitting in their office. Everything was hunky-dory, and a lot of things, which they could click accidentally were not even coming to them because they were in a very caged environment, which was, you can just say, like a golden cage when it comes to working in the enterprise environment. So when I look at it, the macro trend, right, from decentralization of workforce, and when I map it to a decentralization of IT systems, it's not going to happen that ways. And second part is that cybersecurity, typically we were looking at as an umbrella on the top, right? So what we used to do is there's a cage, it's like there's rain happening on a cricket ground, you cover the pitch, you leave the ground open, right? So as long as the pitch is protected, you are more chances of coming back onto the ground faster. So cybersecurity typically has been built in traditionally enterprise for multiple reasons in that way that we keep on adding more cover. But intrinsically, we haven't built it into the systems, right, from employee culture to employee products and to a lot of other things. And I see this decentralization trend is going to actually, we have to think of decentralized IT in the future. Two primary reasons. We saw a globalization wave that is happening, but now more and more digitization happening. I strongly see that there is a deglobalization wave that will happen. You will see a lot of organizations will have to deglobalize their strategies just because of data policies of Europe versus North America versus China are not going to be the same. So we will have to look at that aspect. And lastly, I would say, even if when we say cloud, cloud is a great enabler for all of us, which gives a faster scale and all. But again, the deglobalization aspect has to be taken care of because, if let's say if you're working on one major cloud provider, it may not be present in another geography, right? Some of them are not present in China, some not in Russia. So there's no one global cloud which is available everywhere. So I would say deglobalization is the key, decentralization is the key. We need to think everything in this aspect. For us, specifically what we did, we had to jump onto new tools. I mean, again, I won't say that, something great, but it's all adding new covers that we could do in the fastest possible way when we were looking at this decentralization happening on the workforce.
Right, Ankush, you raised some very important points, and that's the thing about educating your employees, and that's a topic we'll come back to a little later. Before that, before I go to Sunil and John, for your perspective as a vendor here, let's first run the next poll. Can we have the second poll, please? There you go. What, in your opinion, are the biggest cybersecurity threats today for enterprises? Wow. The options are pandemic-related phishing attacks, rising ransomware attacks, social engineering attacks, breaches in the cloud, attacks on IoT devices, and the last option is targeting user devices.
Pretty close, almost like a photo finish.
I feel supply chain attack should also have been added in the list.
Yeah, supply chain attack through what? Through one of these only, yeah? You can attack the supply chain through multiple points.
Multiple points, of course.
Okay, 246 out of people are still voting. Okay.
See, pandemic-related phishing attacks are still so high, no? Now with the vaccine in and all. Okay, I think we can stop the polling.
68% have voted. Yeah, okay. So there you go. Pandemic-related phishing attacks, 54%. Rising ransomware attacks is at 57%, closely followed by targeting user devices, which is at 49%. Now I come to Sunil. You have seen the audience poll. You're really the person with the feet on the ground. So when you meet Indian companies, what are the trends that you see on cybersecurity?
So I think the poll which is just now has been shown, it is actually similar. So ransomware attacks is one very important which we see. A lot of the enterprise kind of customers, they are facing social engineering, kind of attacks too, which is very and social engineering and targeted attacks. They are kind of they form a similar group in my opinion. So that's where target attacks, which are normally we call them as advanced persistent threats, also APTs. So these are the two kind of attacks which we see. And phishing, as I think mentioned by someone, is constant. Whether whatever is happening, people are just trying to take that as a bait. For example, today it's pandemic time, so COVID or vaccine or anything, so they take that particular topic or context and they keep doing the phishing attacks. So these are the three types which I have seen normally while talking to most of my customers. That's my input on this.
Great. So, John, perhaps you could give us a broader global kind of perspective on this. Do you agree with this poll that we have? Almost 250 top, security guys have voted for this.
Yeah, so I want to react a little bit to what some of my panelists have said earlier, because I think there's some important pieces in there. And that's, I heard a little bit from Zach about, phishing and fish testing. And really that's about talking about security cultures, right? And one of the things that we've lost in the pandemic is the ability to turn to your cubicle neighbor or to your office mate and say, hey, does this email look fishy to you? We don't have that anymore. And so it's more important now that you actually continue to drive the security culture agenda forward so that people are recognizing and supporting the organization, making sure they're safe and secure. So, and the zero trust thing is really important as well, because I think now we're wrapping context, or we're wrapping protection around the user as opposed to the environment. As for this poll, I think it's really indicative of the security, the threat landscape right now, which is everything's out there. All threats are still relevant. Ransomware is the noisiest, it's the costliest, it's the most damaging. But at the end of the day, ransomware, as I said in the opening, is the most visible and usually the last sign of an attack in your network. The first sign could be something as benign as just an email that puts a dropper on your box, which then goes and fetches an additional payload, which could not be ransomware, it could be a banking Trojan. And once that banking Trojan is done stealing all your financial information, then the ransomware guys swoop in and encrypt your data. So there's a whole lot of things that you need to do to protect an environment against cyber criminals today. And all of them must be done at least to a high enough degree to protect yourself. Again, risk mitigation, right? Reduce that risk as much as possible. And that's why security is difficult, because we have to do all these things right. But you can't do all these things right until you start with the basics. And I think Mr. Swaminathan was talking about this earlier when he's talking about, look, let's focus on doing things like patching, right? Let's make sure we get that right. And as we move along the scale of security maturity, there's going to be a point where you start doing threat hunting, because when you do see that one phishing email, maybe if you see it on 5 workstations, it's time to investigate, because what else is happening in your network? And that's where we need to strive to move that the ball forward down that security maturity landscape to as far as possible for our organizations. And if you don't have the capabilities, go see a partner, a trusted partner, to help you with that.
Right.
So John, if I can jump in just on that, just
sure.
one real quick one. Operationally, a lot of the organizations don't have the maturity to get to always on security, right? So when you look at a 3-month scan versus having an agent that's always scanning and reporting back. And now the operating systems are getting to a point where if you configure them right, you are always automatically getting kernel updates, like Red Hat does that, for example, right? And then, the patching process itself getting 100% automated, something that we do in the cloud. I think operationally, to your point, there's some basic things fundamentally that have to start to change. They require a lot of investment within the program from ground up. So there's the perimeter from the outside, and internally how you are shifting to secure coding practices so that the software you're building is very secure, and then the operating systems, and then logical access management. So it's really not just one thing, as you said. It really is a holistic program that you have to dive in and do it.
Right, Zach. As you mentioned, it's about investment. It's about knowledge, educating the organization as well as people around it. And as we were talking, it's been half an hour, and we have 44 questions actually. So I'll take one. So I'll take one question to Prateek. The question is that, see, while we've moved to remote working, a lot of work also gets done on our mobile phones. We access office work on mobile. So what are the measures that can be taken for mobile security? That's a question that is coming in from Rajiv Malik.
Absolutely. That's a very good question if you ask me, because now that we have moved to remote work, no matter what the device is, and now with the SaaS application, we can, we have the access to application on our tips, at our ease. So in those cases, the organization can play, or your company can play a vital role where they can enforce the same policies that they are using for the corporate devices, so that you unmindfully do not end up compromising the corporate data, where because of the reason that your browser, the counter browser and the inbuilt browsers that you may be using on your phone may not be equipped enough to show you the same security errors that you may be receiving or getting when you are browsing it through through your system or through your laptop. In that case, you may miss those warnings. You may miss those warnings, and it may lead to some kind of impact or some kind of malicious activity. So in a nutshell, the organizations, organizations can make sure that they enforce the same kind of policy and the device policy and data policy on the mobile devices. At the same time, we talk about endpoint protection platform and endpoint security on our laptops and desktops all the time, but we very rarely talk about the mobile security and kind of endpoint protection or antivirus that we need on the on the mobile devices. So we should also look at complementing the policy management and policy enforcement along with the mobile threat defense capabilities, which could guard you against the antiviruses and the payloads that may be getting downloaded because of the applications and browsing that you may be doing.
Okay, and user devices is a hugely interesting and fascinating thing. And talking of phishing, I got a phishing message, a couple of weeks ago. Then, of course, I don't want to talk about it here, but I managed it pretty well. I didn't let any threat through the organization.
Yeah, unlike me, who ended up paying 5,000 rupees.
Right. I'll come to Mr. Swaminathan. We were briefly chatting about this yesterday, and you'd like to tell us a little bit about what you think. While we have been all talking about the threat in the spike in the cyber threats and all, the spike really happened in April and May, right? And since then, it has more or less plateaued, or it has come down, right? So you can tell us a little about it. Is it has it really come down? Has the pace of growth of the cyber attacks? Has it slowed? And what does that imply?
No, I would say, see, it's slowed. It's kind of come to probably marginally above the pre-pandemic level, so to speak, in terms of the kind of attacks that are coming in. And I will share a couple of instances that we have been observing. Like you said, you got a phishing, and now some of these are getting more and more sophisticated. So we had some somebody reporting from the finance that since they deal on the treasury front with different kind of banks, and banks typically may say they have their own email platform for external users to come and pick messages or do any interactions. So while this bank never had that kind of interaction, they said because of COVID, you need to go and pick up a message from a particular site. And, like was mentioned earlier, somewhere the whole user awareness of, people seeing some kind of a red flag really helped. So, this was then escalated back to our CISO team, and then they guided them to make sure what exactly was there. And it was actually that you go to the site, there was a, kind of a spike document there, which if you had downloaded would have caused issues. So that has been kind of a variation that has been happening there in terms of a post-pandemic, but again related. So they're trying to use this as an angle so people feel that there is a natural justification for something to be, going in that direction. Now, one point I wanted to add in terms of, I think Zach's response on, the whole auto patching. So while we have done, again, over a period, earlier, the whole patching cycles were sporadic and you find out, okay, where you're lagging behind. And we moved on to the continuous part. So we have more visibility on where we lag and how do we do. Some of the challenges, just to be clear on that, is sometimes the old applications start breaking. And that's something we have to be aware of. So while on one hand, you have the whole security aspect to cover with the, the whole patching cycles, you can't afford to have any negative impact on the business. So that's a balance that we need to always carry and make sure that, some of these are, not impacting the business. At the same time, the risk aspect of it is also covered there.
Right, Mr. Swaminathan. Also, changing dynamics of a business also would force you to change your entire perspective on security, perhaps. I'll come to Priyank with that question. We were reading in reports that store orders for you guys were up 40% last year, as more and more, people prefer to buy in bulk, especially in the UK and in parts of Western Europe. This also meant that your Bangalore team had to perhaps redesign shelves in the supermarket. And this is in addition to the surge in home delivery orders. So what does all of this surge mean for your business and its security?
I think our online orders have gone up 100%, over the quarters. Every quarter we believe that, it's a Christmas hike, and that's how retail sector see it, sort of a big bang day. But I think they are having multiple Christmas cycles that business has seen. I think from a security perspective, I would just like to build on what Mr. Swaminathan highlighted, that I think my view is that attacks have fairly continued, but I think we have got better at in terms of learning and adapting and catching them early. So sort of, the whole initial spate of phishing and the initial set of trends that we saw, and those sort of trends have come down because maybe we were able to learn through, those instances or incidents and able to fine tune our systems and security and monitoring accordingly. However, as we are learning, so are attackers. So I think by the time we settle down and we think, we have got a sort of grip over the situation, we'll find that there are another new set of trends on the back of, be it sort of phishing or other set of indicators, which will be picked. So I think as panelists have also highlighted, we have to continuously evaluating our system, our posture. It's not a quarterly sort of cycle where you evaluate and sit and wait for something to happen, but you have to be continuously assessing your posture and see where new set of trends are emerging, look at your alert and sort of monitoring and sort of reports, and see if there are anything that you need to really focus on, and have the ability to quickly sort of, then support those areas with your sort of skills and resources, be it from a policy and control standpoint, so that you can quickly respond to it with an effective strategy.
Right. And strategy also has to be backed by money, right? By investment. So that is another area that we really need to look at. I want to come to Ankush with that. I've been seeing a lot of reports when you're a product engineering and lifecycle services company, right? So that's a hugely high-tech kind of affair these days, with products being such precision engineering going on into modern products. And I noticed that you said you're now going to set up a TCMS lab in Hyderabad, right? Along with Bombardier. Correct. So, which is great. Now, the point is for an organization like yours and for the kind of work that you do, the high tech engineering work, there's a lot of cybersecurity risk also, and a lot of money riding on the risk that comes with it, right? So, what sort of investments? I mean, you don't have to give us a real number or anything, but you tell us that is there a growth in terms of security related investments in the organization or in your related industry?
I think very good question, Alokesh. So I'll give you I have been, let's say, on the product engineering side doing cybersecurity for from 2008, 2009, 11. We tried to go sell cybersecurity as part of, inbuilt into the products. Let me tell you, we didn't get any dollars, right? I mean, we got good meetings. We never got any dollars. But of late, the good part is now we see the trend changing, right? And as what I say that it was seen as more as an enabler or a tick mark at a lot of times, which was not good. I mean, I'll give an example, right? I mean, if you look at any enterprise in our country today, we have a security guard outside the company, which is typically outsourced, right? Nobody cares what is the quality of that. I mean, I think it's unfair to say nobody cares. We care, but I think the seriousness of that probably is under question, right? We saw a similar approach towards, let's say, when we were doing product engineering, and we tried to say that, hey, cybersecurity, there's an additional effort of, let's say, this much amount of money we will have to put and make sure that the product is inbuilt cyber secure. Let me tell you, every time it was questioned and most of the times it was taken out, right? How much ever we tried to say it is important. But the big change is nowadays, we don't have to do that hard sell. Sometimes if we miss it, the customers ask, hey, what's your cybersecurity approach? And I think
Nice.
Prateek was mentioning that VAPT, right? Vulnerability assessment. I think today in a lot of things that we are doing, it's a hygiene factor. And now the complexity is that, for global companies, let's say you took a name about Bombardier, which is public news, right? When they are doing business across the globe, cybersecurity is about protecting their product, but at the also same time ensuring that we are following the laws of the land, because on cybersecurity implementations, different geographies bring in different implications, even on the software product specification and the build-up that you will do. So overall, I would say it's a positive sign. We all have matured. We all are looking at a big digitization wave that is happening. And it is great to see the maturity coming at all sides of an inbuilt cybersecurity system rather than like an over-the-top play, which will not give the level of security that is required for the world of tomorrow. And, I would say in our country, if you look at what Aadhaar has done to us and how seamlessly we are doing some of the things and in a very good manner, I think it's one of the best examples globally that I could say of a system performing fantastic work. I mean, we had some bad news about it, some hacks on it a few years back, but today, if you see the amount of systems that are using Aadhaar and running amazingly well in an amazing time is hats off to the team which has done it, and the country has great infrastructure on that right now.
Yeah, they've used those to go from strength to strength, the entire Aadhaar framework that was there. We have a question from Alicia. She's part of the audience. She has a question. Alicia, if you can hear me, you can switch your camera on. Her question is for Mr. Murad and Mr. Swaminathan. So, Alicia, can we have your camera switched on? You can switch on your camera and ask
you
the
asked
question.
your question and moved away? Are you still there with us? That's the trick question there. Looks like you're not with us. Okay.
Okay. Alicia So the question was interesting. She asked, what would you do when your endpoint is under attack or have been compromised? Time and effort that's involved is the first part of the question. Second part of her question is, are your organization still using signature-based AV? Can you name the new software tools used by them to have control over endpoints? For both Mr. Murad and Mr. Swaminathan, whoever wants to go first.
Yeah, I would rather not comment on what software we use for obvious reasons, right? At the same time, I think it's a very important question. So, you need to have layers of security within your environment. For example, you need to have preventative and detective controls. And from a detective controls, as you have logging enabled, all of those logs are going through a SIM as well as you have a SOC that is monitoring those alerts coming in and then being able to react. I think the metrics that John provided early on very telling, which is the time to detect can be 5 days from threat detection on average, and India is 9.5 days. So it's not just important that you have a SOC that's there, but it's actually a functioning SOC, and the detective controls are not just there as a tick and box; they're actual real things that are detecting. So, if you have a corporate device, you'll have scanning software that's always running that will detect those, and they can alert you that there's something that is being compromised. Those are, most corporates will have that. That's very standard now, and there are a lot of vendors that allow you to do that. You also have then all of those logs that are coming in, as I mentioned, through a logging framework that are then being consolidated within corporate. If you have a VDI, which is containerized and is very secure, then even if the endpoint is compromised, you have some level of protection, right? At the same time, if it's a phishing email, then you are completely compromised. If you have a application that is running and that application has not been built securely, and I mentioned this, which is, just like you're using an email, you're the first line of defense, your developer is the first line of defense when it comes to secure coding practices, which means that the development environment that they're using, does it actually have a plugin that automatically scans every time they're writing code? And this is something that Ankush is talking about from a product engineering perspective. The products that you're building have been built with secure mindset, and then the operating system that they're running is automatically getting scanned. So when the product is built and goes out, you're comfortable that it's built and it's engineered to the right level. And then you have a feedback loop. So unfortunately, it's not a single answer. You have to start from the beginning all the way in, and then continuously keep updating it and keep an eye on it.
Yeah, Mr. Swaminathan, you were the other person who had to answer.
Sure, yeah. No, I think Zach covered it extremely well. I think I'll just add on to that in the sense that while the endpoint in, I think, case is the entry point for any issue to be, coming into the environment, unless the other aspects of your infrastructure, the whole ecosystem is secure enough, it will not limit to that point alone. And like was mentioned by Zach, unless your applications, the other infrastructure like operating systems are all either OS being hardened, your apps being, following a very secure development lifecycle, each of these will, start becoming the next hop for anything that is coming into your environment. So that's a big part of how do we make sure that, if there is an issue coming that is initiated on the endpoint, you try to, how is it cordoned off to that point alone, and rather than spreading to other parts of your environment. And, one part where, let's say even if you cordon it off to that particular device or endpoint, what we have been also working with, few startups is, what kind of a risk am I carrying? Is this an endpoint that had, say, highly sensitive data? So is that, so that's something we've been working with. So we know based on the kind of data available on that machine, we kind of have an objective view of the risk and the data loss that could have been happening if that endpoint has been compromised. So that's something we've been, doing beyond, like I think what Zach mentioned was like extremely appropriate in terms of the endpoint, but some of the stuff that we are trying to do so that we not stop at that, but also see what other risks we carry purely from that endpoint perspective.
Thank you, Mr. Yeah, go on.
Yeah, if I can just add one more thing, the detection software is getting very sophisticated as well, right? So enterprise software that is being put in, they're using a lot of machine learning algorithms, AI, to start to detect those anomalies. So it's not just, because there's a lot of noise that comes in that gets thrown at the SOC, right? And what is a real threat versus what is not a real threat. And those machine learning algorithms allow you to get rid of a lot of that noise, so that, the better those models get, those AI models get, the more you're now actually looking at anomalies. What is the one that you have to go after? And that's where I think the biggest challenge from a SOC perspective is, otherwise you're going to invest, you're going to have 1 million people look at 1 million alerts, or you're going to have, a smaller staff that is able to crunch through 1 million alerts, right? And that, you don't always see that, but that's really what ends up in the behind the curtains when the SOC team is looking to address those alerts.
I'll go back to a thread of conversation we were having before Alicia asked her question, that is about investment. pandemic, even after on the other side of the pandemic with the vaccine, as we've observed that certain amount of remote working will continue with all organizations, with most organizations. So my question is for Prateek. Do you think that this remote working will mean that the risk weightage given to cybersecurity will move up in its priority given the entire risk framework of a company?
Absolutely, I strongly feel that the priority and the weightage towards endpoint security when it comes to the overall security posture of the organization has gone much higher and will go certainly more higher, for the reason that if you look at it now, we are becoming boundaryless, with all the employees and associates working remotely from their respective places. And as Ankush mentioned, that we are not working from home, we are working from anywhere and everywhere. That means we are no longer looking at 2 or 3 branches of our organization, but looking at 5,000, 10,000 branches of the organization. That means the endpoint device and the endpoint laptop and system that we are using, they are your new perimeter. They are your new perimeter of the organization, and they are being used to access your critical resources of the organization when it comes to data, regulatory data, and all of these aspects. And even, if you look at it, even if you are allowing your employees and associates to use their own laptops because of the reason that you may not be able to ship those on time, in those cases your identity is becoming the new perimeter. So in all these aspects, having a robust endpoint security capability on your, or securing your endpoint will definitely increase the security posture to a larger extent, because they are subjected to a lot of attacks, and as if you look at the attackers, they're always trying to attack the weakest chain in the cybersecurity ecosystem, or the weakest chain in the ecosystem. And and for the reason that endpoint security, or not the endpoint security but the endpoint, if you look at the users of the endpoint, they may not be security experts, they may be business folks who may be focusing, and who are not just maybe, who are focusing on so many other aspects than just the security. So if you look at the awareness level of the people who are using these endpoints, it varies drastically from team to team and person to person. And that is where you need a standardized way of delivering the security and making sure that the endpoint is secured well enough. And we have been talking about the availability as one of the core principles of security all this while, but now the availability of security resources and capability delivered to you, no matter how you are connected, whether you are in the enterprise, connected through the enterprise network, through VPN, or on the open internet, or not connected at all, you should have the same set of capabilities delivered to you irrespective of the location, and you should have the same kind of security posture maintained. So that has become very, very important nowadays.
I think if I
Suchet,
can add
Yeah,
to
yeah.
this
go ahead, please.
allocation, Suchetana, is I
Sure.
think the enterprise of tomorrow needs to
Hmm.
think of some disruptors that are going to be there and that can help them the problem that we are staring at, right? I mean, the number of endpoints are increasing at a pace. It will be really difficult for us to have VPN for everybody and things like that. I think the experts on this panel will know that we can't have the number of laptops that we have. We just can't have that scalable VPN model. It's challenging. It's very challenging, right? So two things you need to understand: what are the disruptors? One is, I would say, the compute in the cloud is becoming cheap as we are going, and it's going to, the Moore's laws are going to apply, and it's going to get cheaper. Second is the bandwidth is getting fatter, right? And we are actually looking at, I mean, pandemic delayed it, but I think this year we are actually already seeing 5G launches. We'll see it in India as well. I mean, we will pick up slowly in our country, but surely we will pick it up. We are going to look at enterprise 5G networks, like things like, there's certain nice policies coming onto that one as well. So I think if you look at compute and if you look at bandwidth getting fatter, do you want to look at that? Do you want to have endpoints running applications, or do you want to have dumb thin clients using applications running somewhere, right? So can you categorize your application in these two categories? Look at your IT infrastructure in that way. Can you see of optimizing the IT infrastructure, looking at it? Everything doesn't need to run on endpoint even today, right? If we do that, I mean, we try to move everything to endpoint, but can we split this, take a judicious call and prepare for tomorrow and see that, how the IT investments may look in favorable direction than implementing, let's say, VPN kind of solutions for every endpoint.
Right, and in fact, with this, I'll just come to Sunil with the question, that we are discussing right now in terms of, because when you're looking at, when we are saying that companies are beginning to recognize that, the cybersecurity risk weightage is going up, right? So they should be actually spending more time thinking about it, they should be spending more, not necessarily more money all the time, but at least they should be engaging with people like you, Sunil, and with John, right, to understand where their vulnerabilities might be. Do you see that kind of interest? Do you see a rise in the understanding that the security risk needs to be given more credence in an organization?
So Alokesh, I think very, very valid question. I would say that there is a bit of rise, but I still believe that more engagement has to happen and more, I still, I think when Ankush was talking about cloud, I wanted to comment upon before coming back to Alokesh, your question, is that today I still see so many companies when I go and visit them, these CISOs and CIOs, and they tell me that they are helpless and I don't not able to understand. They say, no, we are only going for on-premise kind of security, and I'm sorry, we cannot go for cloud security. I said, I'm telling you, and on this dais, I can tell verbally with so much of thumping noise that if you are not using cloud security, your security is just 50%. As John Shier was talking about, that security is something about managing risk. I personally believe that if we are not moving to cloud security, it's a big, big challenge which any customer is going to face. Number one. Number two, in terms of Prateek talking about that board has started recognizing this as the second. I still believe that most of the companies, at least in India, I'm talking about, is yet to understand that. They understand, they listen, but when it comes to investment, I'm sorry to say, they just like the decisions are always being delayed and they're not being taken. So for example, CISOs and CIOs, they firmly believe that yes, this investment has to happen. But when they go back to the CEO and CFO for that approval, it just gets delayed. And it's been happening. What I'm seeing is probably in this pandemic time, because of like people are talking about, oh, we are having a less revenue or a less profitability, or maybe this particular is down, our BU is down right now. We'll come back to you. So as Sophos, when I go and talk to people, I always see a delay. Yes, there is an awareness. I'm not denying the fact that there is a percentage rise allocation, but still yet to happen on a level which is required. A lot of people are talking about endpoint protection. To be frank, how many of them are using actually EDR kind of capabilities on their endpoint? Not even 1 to 2% location, which is like that's where, and people are talking about that we need to have that skill set, expertise. I think Suchetana in the beginning said someone was talking about the training and skill set and abilities. But today, to be very frank, it is not possible to have all these skill set in your house. Someone has to just transfer to third party, and that believe that there is a third party who has to do and give that SLA. So I think that's my opinion on your question. Thank you.
Thank you.
Alokesh, if I may just add to a point, because I think it's a very, very valid point that you have brought out, because I think when we talk about investment, and I think a general perception is we are talking about dollar amount. And, that's all we, as a CISO or security leaders are interested in, just give certain amount of, a budget and we will buy security tools. But I think it is equally about having investment from a perspective of time and effort of the business of an organization. How many times you get time with the board and leadership? How many times security leaders are invited into business forums, so present from a security strategy why it is important? How many times project teams take into account effort required to implement security controls as part of, let's say, some sort of code development? So I think we need to have a more holistic view of the investment that we need from the business, because otherwise it will be very fragmented or isolated implementation of controls, which will not be effective because business will not be aware of it. They may not fully comply with it, and it will be, as I think we have been discussing, it will be more of patch on the top rather than something which is embedded as part of the environment. So I think we really need to look at, when we seek investment, it should be more holistic conversation than just about budgets.
And when you think about a company like Tesco, which is like everywhere and everywhere around the world, then it becomes even more of a nightmare to get everybody to agree on something, you know?
Yeah, but I think that's I think at the first place you recognize that this is how you need to approach it, and I think you need to build your case and you need to keep at it, because till the time you're not recognizing that there is a holistic approach to it, you may end up yourself in a trap, because even if you get the amount, you may not be able to secure and there could be an incident.
Right. Let's come to our second attempt at an audience question, and we have Yash Jethani with us. He has a rather interesting question. Yash, I believe you are now with us.
Yes.
Right. Can we have your question, please?
Hi, I'm Yash. Hopefully you can hear me.
Yeah, we can hear you. Go ahead.
Yeah, thanks for the enlightening session. I'm from IDC. So I had a question on the cost front, and this was put up very, very nicely by Mr. Sunil Sharma and to some extent by Ankush also. So most organizations in India view security as a cost, and until they receive a ransomware attack, when the brand gets tarnished finally, that's when they recognize it's important to invest in that network. So my question is more around the network operators, and can vendors themselves start selling those zero trust products and services so that the entire cost is now shared on everyone instead of one organization. So it's more to do with democratization of the security itself. Now that we have deglobalization happening across the board, and Mr. Ankush also pointed to that. So do we have that? Do we have those bodies in place at a national level that suck up that cost at a national level and then trickle down to the company level?
Okay. Who wants to take that?
Who wants to take the question?
It's a question that, John, you might want to just give your views on at a slightly broader level.
Yeah, let's be honest. Zero trust isn't for everybody. It's not going to apply to every organization and in every industry, but it definitely is something that is the way forward. As we start thinking about how do we protect against future threats, we need to start thinking about what technologies are available to us and what advanced technologies are coming out and are going to help with this particular this particular new normal, if you will, with cyber threats increasing in complexity and increasing in speed and scope and size. So, at Sophos, we're working towards this, right? We're working towards providing a complete zero trust product that will help your organization manage all this stuff. It comes down to a lot. What I've been hearing in this discussion is, there's discussions about priorities, there's discussions about costs. It comes down to having the understanding of your organization, the understanding of really an honest look at your organization and where are you today on that security maturity scale, and where do you need to go? And if you're not anywhere near the zero trust piece, then maybe you don't go there. But if you are, then you need to start considering that. As far as the costs of how you spread that out, I'll leave that to the C-levels on the panel that manage these budgets to understand, to speak more towards, how are they planning on deploying this to the organizations in a way that doesn't incur too many costs.
Right. Hey. Anybody else wants to take a stab at this question? Well,
yeah,
yeah, sure. Go ahead, Mr. Tiwari.
Yeah. So, yes, good question. And, there are a couple of things that you will see when any democratization of tech happens, right? So if you look at the software world, the open source part has increased tremendously in last 10 to 15 years, right? And if you try to spread it by domain wise, I think cybersecurity still that is not as open as is being talked about. Can it happen? Absolutely yes. Will it happen? I am very confident about it. It's going to happen, right? So how do some of the costs come down when community gets bigger and bigger, and some of those investments gets created from the open source things? I mean, it really helps. Now, the second part is when it comes to justifying the ROI piece, right? And this is for people who understand Hindi. In India, we have a very good ad, where the guy is standing beside a yacht and finally asking, "Kitna deti hai?" Right? I mean, that's his question. And to be very honest, I mean, we should not shy away from that, right? Being a country, if we have done so many things so frugally and so are able to do it right, there is no harm in asking that question. So if you're not able to justify that, I would say maybe it's a better idea to relook at it. Are we able to justify the threat? So imagine if I am say if I'm a finance guy, maybe the best way to explain me the financial threat is when I see a loss happening on ransomware, then I'm ready to write the check on cybersecurity, right? Because that's what I could quickly translate in my head. So maybe at some times, probably we are not able to translate or communicate the threat properly, or that's why people are not getting it. But somewhere something is breaking, right? That's why people are not buying it upfront or not ready to do it upfront. But there is maybe a translation loss. Can we translate better? But it has to be done because this is something we all understand is not going to be an enabler function. It is a must function. It's not a transformational function. It is a must-have function. So I think the industry is getting it. We need to make sure we're ready for it. And again, I think we need to see more open source.
Thank you, Yash, for your question. In fact, thank you. In fact, the World Economic Forum comes up with the Bible of risk framework, which is called the Global Risk Report. And the report for 2021 puts cybersecurity as one of the top 7 risks that it has identified. And when it identifies the risk, it says that it is not a business requirement or a futuristic thing. It is a must for businesses in 2021. With that, let's move to our poll number 3. So can we have the third poll up, please? Thank you. So what, in your opinion, are the biggest challenges in securing the cloud? There are multiple choices. The first choice is data breaches and downtime, vendor lock-in being the second, then insecure interfaces and APIs, shared technology vulnerabilities, and lack of transparency regarding data storage and security systems for data. Those are the options for the question. That is, what in your opinion are the biggest challenges in securing the cloud?
There is one which is not there. Part of this is that lot many people don't even understand that it's a shared responsibility. While you are securing the cloud, it's not just the cloud provider responsibility, it's the responsibility of you as an organization too. So that is something which, anyway, move on the poll.
Again, 3 of them are very close. Okay. Data breaches and downtime, insecure interfaces. APIs are supposed to be the panacea for all sorts of problems, right? But they create their own problems. I think we can stop the poll.
Yeah, more than 60% have voted, so yeah.
Lack of transparency regarding data storage and security systems for my data. That's a big concern. I think there has been a lot of talk about how the cloud providers are not very transparent about how they are storing your data and how they are making it secure. But let's take this question to Mr. Swaminathan from Chola. Mr. Swaminathan, your reaction to this poll and your thoughts around security on the cloud?
No, I think probably the option missing is our lack of understanding of the way we need to operate in the cloud. And I think, like was mentioned there, it is a shared responsibility. Just because we are in the cloud doesn't mean a lot of things come in by default. So while some of the basics are already there, if you see the typical nature of breaches that happen in the cloud, it could be something like somebody has misconfigured an S3 bucket, or the basics like a database authentication is not having a 2-factor setup and all that. So this is purely stuff that you should be doing irrespective of you are on the cloud or on-prem. But then some of that comes down to how well you understand when you're moving from an on-prem. It's not a lift and shift when you're moving from what you had on an on-prem or a co-located setup to cloud. Once you do that, you need to understand the architecture and the way it is configured. And that you will see will constitute the biggest majority of issues happening there. And I disagree that cloud, if you architect well, is a vendor lock-in kind of situation. If you do it well, and unless you are totally onto a SaaS kind of setup, it may be a different. But if you are taking applications onto a cloud native setup and deploy, whether it's on any of the major providers, you should be able to quite without significant effort move across. So vendor lock-in, I don't think is there. The transparency part, maybe again, that's especially in the Indian context, most of the major providers end up being organizations that are headquartered outside of India. So making sure, how do you at some point either contractually enforce that you have visibility into where your data is hosted, where it is getting replicated, whether from a zone or a DR perspective. Those may be to put in there. But my key point on this is, a lot of issues happen because of lack of understanding of how you need to architect and configure and run in the cloud.
Right. I'll go to Mr. Murad with that. Do you think lack of understanding is the biggest problem here?
Oh, I absolutely agree. In fact, my first reaction was configuration management and scanning of those configurations to your policies is missing.
Right.
As a lot of companies move to the cloud, they will have infrastructure people and people that develop on-prem. They're used to developing in data center. They're generally going to be the ones that are also now operating the cloud, and they're going to be going through a maturity curve in terms of understanding, learning. It's good for their careers, so I think that's a fantastic thing. At the same time, they don't know what they don't know, right? Which means that the point about S3 buckets or how you manage your encryption keys, where and how you're securing them. If you look at some of the large data breaches that have happened, they've happened because somebody left something open that they didn't realize from a configuration perspective, and that's really what's going to come out. So you're going to have a policy. You're going to tell everybody you should encrypt your S3 buckets. Okay, I'm on AWS and I'm encrypting them. At the same time, do you have the right scanning software to make sure that that is actually happening? A lot of the security rules that you've built in from a policy perspective, are they adhering? Now what we're moving to is a lot more sophistication with Kubernetes as the new operating system with containers. How are the container level security being managed? And are they being managed by policies? So they're new software, open source software like OPA or Open Policy, agent, or that you're establishing and you're running and you're managing security through policies. In other words, what I'm saying is there's a lot more sophistication in the cloud. And in fact, what you end up being is a lot more secure in the cloud. And to Swaminathan's perspective, you don't actually get lock-in if you understand what services you're building and what abstraction layers you're building. So if I have a container, I'm running on top of a container, well, I can run that on Azure, I can run it on Google, I can run it on AWS. But if I'm using a managed service that is very much like tuned to AWS, for example, I'm using AWS Lambda functions, I do have some tie-in, but I can even abstract that out by using and running it on top of something called a serverless framework, which means that I can abstract that out and then I can run it. But then the minute that you start to do that, this is what Andy Jassy from AWS will say, is you're now looking for the common denominator. So you're not really actually exploiting the capability that some of these cloud providers provide to you. So you have to figure out and build up that balance. What are the things? Why did I go to the cloud? Do I want to make use of AWS capabilities that are unique to AWS or Azure or GCP? And of course, if they're the only cloud provider that provides you that capability, you're going to have that lock-in, but just keep an eye on that exit cost. If I were to transpose over, what that will be. For majority of the stuff, it's actually going to be relatively easy to what Swaminathan said to be able to port over.
Very comforting, and it's actually a very good strategy. Zach and Swaminathan, both of you, thanks for your insights. I'm sure the audience will also pick up quite a few real insights from that and, bring them into action. I want to, we are almost at the close of our program. It's like 5:24, if I'm not mistaken. Yeah, I'm almost right, 1 minute ago. And so we'll take one last question before we end, and I will throw this open, but I'll go to Priyank first. We spoke about employees and how you can keep, how you need to keep your employees, aware. The fact also is now that your employees, like, we have discussed today, employee is not inside your perimeter. The employee is everywhere, right? They're at their homes. They're at, work from anywhere. Like, so I could be working from my car, right? Which I might have parked in a parking lot in the city parking lot somewhere, and I'm using probably a local Wi-Fi over there to connect, and I'm using it, right? So it's so very critical for employees, for you to guard your employees. How do you do that in a remote paradigm?
I think one is there is no single approach to it, right? Each organization may have different ways of approaching employee awareness and employee training. Some organizations make it more voluntary, whereas in some organizations, based on the nature and scale and complexity and the data involved, there could be more focused approach. So just to take an example, at Tesco, we have different sets of trainings. One could be in general, which could be applicable to all sets of employees, whereas based on the nature and profile of the role and the kind of data that is being handled. So for an example, if a European data is involved, there are more specific training around which are mandatory for certain roles and which are required to be done on a certain periodicity. I think the second element is you need to also test the learning, right? It is not just about assuming that employees have understood everything on their own and they will be able to apply it in the right way. And that's where tools like phishing simulation helps. Whereas what's the level of understanding, and and you can increase the complexity of those simulations as well to keep testing to what an extent they will be able to spot certain set of trends and risks. And I think, and then being part of business forums will also help, just to have the mind share that it is something which leadership really acknowledge, and they see this is important for the function and for the teams. And I think then you will have more mind share with your employees.
Okay, we're completely running out of time, but before we go to John to summarize this great panel discussion that we had today, I'll just take one question to Mr. Bhajanka. There are, in the Indian context, our laws are largely silent on certain aspects, and that's exactly why you have outfits running out of various parts of India whose only work is to attack, is to basically compromise your cybersecurity. We all know what happened to a well-known journalist recently and how she got duped, despite she having taken various measures. So, what are the steps that a company can take in the scenario like India, where you don't have laws always to help you out?
Absolutely. The employee awareness, as Priyank and Sunil mentioned, that employee awareness is very much important. If you look at it, employees and the human layer is the weakest layer in the chain at this point of time. So the awareness is something that can not be substituted with anything. But definitely when it comes to checks, having a defense in depth strategy where you are taking care of, where anything that is coming into your organization is coming through various types of filters, which could help you in reducing the attack surface and making it much easier for the end user to trust if it has come to my email, if it has come to my system, or if I'm able to browse this, that means I'm able to rely on it, or I can be 100%, if not 100%, reasonably sure and confident that I can click on this link, I can act on this particular email and go about it. So employee awareness and the security responsibility that the organization takes when it comes to applying the rules and enforcing the policy is very, very important. There is no one single answer. Having a single shot answer to this is, we would end up solving the cybersecurity problem if we, talk about one single solution. Yeah, absolutely.
Of course. I'll come to John to summarize this panel. Clearly, it is time for India to wake up, perhaps, and for the board also to participate. How do you summarize this panel?
Thank you. I've been taking notes as people have been speaking here, and one of the things that has become clear to me is that, all threats are still relevant. It's not just ransomware. That's the most visible one. It's the most damaging. But in order to protect against these threats, you need things like a working SOC. You need to be able to be instrumented in order to be able to detect some of these things and then do something about it. And, things like cloud adoption, zero trust, they help, but they're not a silver bullet, right? If Zach, you were talking about cloud adoption and some of the complexities of that. Like if you've ever looked at the AWS console, there's a lot of switches and buttons and stuff, right? You need to know what you're doing. And so if don't go out alone. If you've got an issue where you want to increase your level of security, but you're not sure how to do it, talk to a trusted partner, talk to somebody. And this is what we're doing here. We're sharing information. This information sharing is really important for our industry, because the more we learn from each other, the more we can raise the level of awareness and security. And really, security is about the security maturity journey is just that. It's not a destination; it's a journey. It's an ongoing thing. And make that honest assessment of your organization. See where you are on that spectrum of security maturity. And treat security as an enabler and as a positive, not just as a negative, as something that, that we used to be the guys that said no all the time. You can't do this, you can't do that. Now we're the people that say yes, and we enable the business. And so while we know there's no one size fits all, We need to understand what our organizations need and move forward with that. And to do that, one of the big things that I've seen on the chat that I've heard from my panelists is we need board level visibility and board level priorities with security. You need to have security in an organization that cuts across all departments, whether it's finance, HR, production, manufacturing, but also have that buy-in and that trust from the board that you're going to be able to protect the organization. So with that, I'll turn it back to Alokesh and Suchetana.
Thank you, John. In fact, this reminds me of a panel that I was chairing of about 12 members of different boards of directors in India. And one of the surprising, and this was, I think, about a year and a half ago, much before COVID. And even at that time, I was pleasantly surprised to see that at least two out of the 12 board members mentioned that there's one big, and we were all talking about compliance and risks and financial risks and investment risks and whatever the board deals with, right? And so these two guys, they pipe up and say, don't forget about cybersecurity. That is one of the biggest threats looking us in the eye, and no board can afford to, look away. So fantastic, John. Thank you for such a wonderful, summary. Thank you all the panelists, for joining us. Zach, Ankush, Sunil, Priyank, Swaminathan, Prateek, John, yourself. Thank you. Thank you, Suchetana, for being such a wonderful co-moderator.
Thank you, Alokesh.
All the people who joined us, more than 350, 380 is the last that I counted. It was a massive crowd. Even now we have more than 250 people who are with us till the last moment.
There are about 74 questions which have actually gone unanswered. We've not managed to answer them, but
sorry about that. We couldn't find the time, but it would take us another couple of hours to get them all answered. But I think really, really wonderful panel, and thank you all for being with us. Goodbye.
Thank you.
Goodbye.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.